Is more than welcome to, and we really appreciate that. There's a donation box at the food table as well as a QR code. Thank you for your support. Before we begin, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and a little bit about AIC. God tells us in the Quran, quote, "To God belongs what is in the heavens and what is on the earth and what is between them and what is under the soul." Steeped in Islamic values of creational stewardship and justice, all of us at American Islamic College believe that God has entrusted the lands and waters he created to humankind, who were created to serve God and the creation as stewards or caretakers. We also believe that we must stand for justice, even when we ourselves may be implicated. So we want to begin today by acknowledging that our campus sits on land that was originally entrusted to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, peoples whose sovereignty, culture, and very lives were violated by colonial policy. We acknowledge and honor them, their descendants, and their land and waterways. Welcoming students of all faiths and backgrounds, American Islamic College is North America's first Muslim college and one of 2 accredited institutions of Islamic higher learning. We're based here in Chicago, and we're grounded in Islamic values. Steeped in Islam's rich and diverse intellectual and cultural traditions, we promote an appreciation for the scope and richness of Islamic history and civilization, both in the classroom and beyond, through impactful teaching and informative public events, highlighting Islam's intellectual, artistic, and cultural expressions. We offer a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in Islamic Studies, a Master of Divinity in Islamic Studies and Muslim Chaplaincy, and every summer we host Arabic language intensive courses at AIC's Arabic Language Institute. So for more information, you can find flyers on your seats and visit us at aicusa.edu. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our notable speaker and commence the lecture program, inshallah. Tonight, we are honored to have back with us Dr. Yousef Casewit, Associate Professor of Quranic Studies at the University of Chicago Divinity School. His research interests include intellectual history of North Africa and al-Andalus, Muslim perceptions of the Bible, and medieval commentaries on the 99 divine names. He has several publications, most recently The Mystics of al-Andalus, Ibn Barajan and Islamic Thought in the 12th Century, a study on Ibn Barajan's life and teachings. Born in Egypt and raised in Morocco, Dr. Casewit is fluent in Arabic, French, and Spanish. He has traveled throughout the Islamic world and has studied with Muslim scholars in Morocco, Syria, and Mauritania. He joins us tonight to speak on spiritual resilience amid war and collapse, reflections on the mystics of al-Andalus. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Yousef Casewit.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Romana, for the kind introduction. I've been turning down a lot of talks or invitations to speak for the last year or so, partly because I didn't quite know what to say in the midst of all the atrocities that we've been witnessing from afar without being able to effect any meaningful change. Why would I go out there and talk about the divine names in a time like 2024? And so I kept turning down invitations to public talks until this idea of spiritual resilience sort of dawned on me, and I think it's a theme that I can reflect on using the sources I've been studying for a long time as part of a much larger, complex situation that we're in. But it's an important one. The question of spiritual resilience, how do you cultivate it? And so the disclaimer is I'm not a theologian speaking constructively within sort of an academic space. I don't write as a constructive theologian. I write as an intellectual historian. I study 12th century texts, and I'm a practicing Muslim, and I give khutbahs once in a while, but I don't publish in book series that are meant to be in dialogue with, let's say, Christian constructive theological traditions going on in seminaries, and this is me thinking out loud about how I can bring some of the knowledge I have to bear upon the present situation, and partly this talk comes out of a certain frustration I feel when I sit through khutbahs where emphasis is placed on activism, and it's hammered in our head over and over. You have to act, you have to do something. Islam is about acting. Islam doesn't have a monastic tradition. We don't go out into the mountains and meditate. We're in society. And I don't agree. Actually, Islam has a profound tradition of withdrawing from the political sphere at certain times. It's called Mecca. The Meccan period stretched for quite a while. It's a foundational period. And it's not clear that we're in Medina right now, if we're going to use the analogies of Mecca and Medina, where Medina you're constructing community, and in Mecca you're facing persecution. It seems to me that we're somewhere between Mecca and Medina, and full out, constant activism leads to burnout and frustration, and a lot of people can lose their faith in the process, faith in God, and so on. So spiritual resilience, as I'm understanding it and thinking about it out loud, is simply it's how do you keep your faith despite the odds. How you have resilient institutions that can withstand an economic collapse, and you have resilient bodies that can face traumatic sort of experiences or illnesses. You have resilient psyches. You have resilient buildings in earthquakes, and you have resilient believers who, when the odds don't look very positive, they stay the course. And so that's what I mean by resilience. In Arabic, it might be something like muruna or something muruna ruhiyya. Or there isn't exactly in the maqam and ahwal literature that I've been reading an exact counterpart to this. Perhaps rida, contentment with God, being satisfied with the divine decree that comes, approving or being content with the divine, might come close to it. Maqamul rida, something along those lines. But so what I want to do to just start the conversation and be part of the present moment, from my vantage point, realizing that there are many moving parts and levels and components. I want to do two things. One, just where I turn to in the Quran for spiritual resilience, because that's obviously the common denominator. Two, I want to then think with Ibn Barrajan al-Ishbili, Ibn Barrajan of Seville, a 12th century Quran commentator on divine names, hadith scholar, who's buried in Marrakesh, that I spent quite some time working on and thinking with. So, for the Quran, the most obvious resource, I think, for us as Muslims thinking in the present moment about how to face the times we're in is to turn to the Hawamim. The Hawamim it's a cluster of surahs from the late Meccan period, when the Muslims were under severe persecution. The odds looked really dire. Fussilat, Ash-Shura, Al-Zukhruf, Al-Dukhan, Al-Jathiyah, and Al-Ahqaf. This is surahs 41, I think, to 47. And it was like in a little booklet, actually, in the earliest period, and it structurally stands out in the Quran. They're sort of longer than the other surahs around them, because the early Muslims carried it around almost like a book of prayers, that was then integrated into the compilation of the Quran toward the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So these surahs were revealed in times of extreme persecution, where some of the most spiritually resilient heroes of the Islamic tradition really shined. And so what jumps out at me when I think of these 7 Meccan surahs are a few key themes. And there's scholarship on the Hawamim, Islam Daya, Walid Saleh, others have written on it. But first of all, these are all the surahs that begin with Hamim. There's 7. So there's an emphasis in the Hawamim on Qur'anan Arabiya, that we've revealed this as a clear Arabic Quran. Why the insistence on Arabic composition at this period of time? the language should be evidence to the audience, right? Well, the Quran, or Allah Ta'ala, is emphasizing here the comprehensibility of the language, perhaps responding to pagan or Jewish or Christian accusations, but saying that بِلِسَانٍ عَرَبِيٍّ مُبِينٍ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا غَيْرَ ذِي عِوَجٍ. This tells me something, thinking with the Quran, with Allah Ta'ala's word, that putting ourselves, like being very clear about who we are and about our message and where we stand is a lesson to be drawn from the Hawamim for the present. So there is sort of a dynamic of oppressor and oppressed, and Allah Ta'ala instructs the believers in the Hawamim to persevere, to endure oppression until divine victory is granted, and cultivate this understanding that Allah Ta'ala does intervene when He so wills. وَلَمَنْ صَبَرَ وَغَفَرَ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ فَاصْبِرْ كَمَا صَبَرَ أُولُو الْعَزْمِ مِنَ الرُّسُلِ. These verses about endurance in these times. Then there's an interesting aspect here that in the Hawamim you have that's where you have these correspondent dialogues in the afterlife between oppressors and their body organs, speaking back to them and testifying against their own, against them, because they're going against their fitrah, and so the hands and the limbs are speaking against, are testifying against the oppressors. And there's a sort of forensic language, a sort of almost like court cases that's used in the Quran at this time, in these surahs. You have nastansikh, shahida, kitab, sort of pleading guilty, regret, appeal for forgiveness. So reminding the believers of divine recompense and punishment, and also of the fact that when one oppresses, one is just betraying one's own fitrah, and eventually that will eat away at the person who is harming or going against their own innate disposition. And then there's hints at a practical solution in the hawamim, hints at, for the suffering community, at the possibility of emigration. They're not feeling at home, the ground is really shaky under them. There are practical outcomes. وَأَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةٌ. God's earth is vast. You don't attach yourself to one specific physical location if it's harming your deen. There are practical alternatives to preserve your deen. So that's those are some of the thoughts that came to mind as I was trying to reflect on spiritual resilience specifically in the Quran. Now I'm going to turn to Ibn Barajan, who was obsessed with the Quran and spent most of his waking hours contemplating the Quran, and who lived at a time of very, of course, intense persecution and political instability. So this is the 12th century, if you can try to sort of look back. So my first point is, okay, the first resource we have is the Quran. The second is communities of Muslims who lived in difficult times, and this is one that I've studied closely. A third is, of course, looking to other communities who've suffered collective trauma or moral injuries or whatnot. And I'm speaking from the perspective of someone just witnessing, not within a war zone, to be clear, but looking at the plight of African Americans in this country, or Jews who survived the Holocaust, and so on. These are all, lessons can be drawn by way of how to and how not to respond to trauma and to atrocities and oppression. So, 12th century, Ibn Barajan, he's at the head of this, you could say, school or trend in Islamic thought. He identifies himself as a mu'tabir, a contemplator. And it's close to the Sufi tradition in the sense of seeking an intensive religious life and seeking to purify oneself. But the mu'tabirun of al-Andalus, this is a distinct Andalusian sort of style, mystical tradition or spiritual tradition that flourishes in what's now southern Spain and Portugal. And I examine the mu'tabirun, or the contemplatives, literally, in my book, The Mystics of al-Andalus. And so what they do, what I find interesting, is that they develop this vibrant tradition within a divided world that's transitioning politically from the Al-Murabitun to the Al-Muwahidun, the Al-Muravids to the Al-Muhad dynasty, 12th, 13th century, very delicate and tricky time politically. They're contending with aggressive Christian advances from the north. This is the strong Reconquista. The Muslims and the Jews are being gradually expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. There's internal political corruption. The Almoravids are really ineffective at governing a transregional empire. There's disruptive piracy along the Mediterranean shores. Very few people went on Hajj from the Islamic West at that period. Jurists were saying you should just participate in protecting the borders instead of going on Hajj. At the time, there were a lot of fatwas going back and forth between the jurists of the day. Fierce crusader incursions in the Islamic East that they were hearing about. These were no easy times by any means. And so Al-Andalus at that time, without drawing too many sort of false equivalents, but it was plagued by war, social inequalities, economic instabilities, and political turmoil, and its inhabitants had good reason to believe that they were experiencing end times. And if you've had access to Wi-Fi in the last year, there's been a proliferation of talks about the return of the Mahdi and so on. Very, very sort of similar kind of reflexes that I'm sort of detecting. And so to engage meaningfully with the societal issues of their day, these mu'tabirun or these contemplatives supported armed resistance against external military aggressions on Muslim lands, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the formal political structures of the al-Murabitun, which they perceived as morally corrupt and politically incompetent. And so their choice was not to act. It was actually to think long term, to cultivate community, to work directly with community, and to to plant the seeds for the next generation that will hopefully bear fruit. So they really thought long term. And there was a conscious withdrawal from the political sphere because they felt that they would betray themselves by engaging in the political sphere, by trying to face the emir, by receiving salary from the government. And so instead of pursuing, and some did, of course, there were judges, and there's a whole landscape of responses, but these Mu'tabirun, instead of pursuing political leadership, they chose to serve their communities, to pursue lives of religious integrity in remote villages, and they cultivated a deep scholarly and spiritual tradition, which developed independently of the state-sponsored Maliki jurists of the day, whom they perceived to be morally corrupted by their affiliation with a pretty terrible regime. And so that tradition that our reflex as 21st century Muslims would be like, oh no, these are just weird mystics who fled to the mountains and the real people were doing the work in the trenches. That tradition went on to lay the foundation, the intellectual foundations for innovations that will affect the very structure of the Ottoman Empire. The Ibn Arabi comes out of al-Andalus. His thinking is vital for how the structures of power of the Ottomans themselves were formed, and it exemplifies one valid response in a very particular situation to a turbulent world through socially conscious action that's rooted in a blend of profound religious knowledge, deeply realized faith, vigorous intellectual engagement, and transformative spiritual experience directly with the community. And so they did respond sort of uniquely to the challenges of their time, and they had a few sort of key teachings that I find interesting. As the world is collapsing around you, what are you doing, Ibn Barajan? Like, you're writing about the cycles of divine decree and signs of God in nature and how to connect with the divine through his signs in the self and in the Quran and in the world. And so let's just pause for a second and step into his world for just a couple minutes. So he taught in this time that Allah Ta'ala is understood or can be approached, and we can draw near to him through 3 books: the physical cosmos, Revelation, and the human being, and that each of them disclose Allah Ta'ala's qualities in unique ways. So he saw this triangular correspondence between the world out there, the Quran, and the self, and had these remarkable insights. Just one example, and you'll be like, what does this have to do with getting out there and doing God's work on the street? I'll try to get there, but let me just take a second and think with these contemplatives. So Ibn Barajan posits, for instance, one good example is that when you look out to the natural world, there are places where Allah Ta'ala's presence is concentrated, like the sun. The sun is the source of life. It's vital for the invigoration of everything in the here below, in the natural world. Nothing could survive without it. So he called it ayatun khassa. It's like an exclusive, specific sign of Allah. Then he turns to the Quran, and he looks at the verses and he identifies these like intense verses, like the throne verse or the light verse or the Fatiha. And he says, these are ayat khassa. There's like a special layer of the Quran where there's a sort of intensity of resonance or reverberation of the divine presence in these verses. So then he turns to the human being and says, in the human being there's something khas too, which is the heart. And then he'll write a treatise about the connection between the sun, the Fatiha, and the heart. And it might sound kind of eccentric, but it was a profound meaning-making sort of thought system that clearly resonated with the communities who were trying to connect with their tradition in that time. And he stayed God-centered. He stayed faithful to his his role as a transmitter of and contemplator of the tradition throughout. And that sort of triangular thinking led him to be curious in these times of all times about other disciplines. So he starts to read anatomy because he's interested in, the heart and locus, and he starts getting into other fields. And he starts becoming fascinated with astronomy and with the theme of Quranic ordering, Nadm al-Quran. And he becomes one of the one of the pioneers of a few fields, like Nadm al-Quran, which is this very key idea of the coherence of the Quran as a compositional whole. And as a thinker who's using cutting-edge sciences of his day to reflect on the Quran. So he becomes the counterpart of what you might say today would be some really, a pious but nerdy neuroscientist who knows the Quran by heart and has studied the tafsir tradition and is trying to connect dots. And neuroscience is one of the most exciting fields of our time. And he's right there at the table talking to the relevant voices in those intellectual conversations. So you can see how quickly a deepened engagement with the tradition becomes very relevant for the time. Yes, he's digging deep, but once you sort of hit the water table, then you start really connecting with broader conversations out there, which is something I don't think we're doing very well. We've ghettoized ourselves and we're siloed ourselves. We're very insecure about any possible alternative way of thinking about the tradition, and we're very uncomfortable with a creative, dynamic thinker and so on. And so spiritual resilience, as I'm trying to think about it in these times, also entails investment in education, investment in places like AIC, investment in fostering curiosity in our children, and fostering this sort of love for expanding one's horizons and being part of a variety of conversations. And so they were at the forefront of what we might call today religious literacy in those times. But for them, it wasn't just to master the formal religious sciences, in a rote way at a madrasa, but to recognize deep connections and correlations between above and below and the various sciences and the Quran and anatomy and astronomy. They became remarkably original, creative, and vibrant contributors to their tradition. And yes, they did flee to the mountains for a bit because it wasn't the time to engage with structures of political authority, which waned within a few decades and were replaced by the Almohads. And at that time, those teachings became actually quite central to the next dynasty. And so they thought long term. They really they had this sense that meaningful change can't be effected in one lifetime just at the plane of will and activism, but has to be effected at these other levels as well. And so they found profound meaning, gratitude, and wonder amid adversity, and they drew strength and resilience from their experience of the world, teaching that every atom in creation, every Quranic verse, every human cell is divinely placed to reflect God's wisdom. And they emphasized the importance of renewing this sense of wonder, and that's how you renew and refresh your iman, by once again appreciating the flower on the street and the insight and the verse of poetry and the Quranic verse that we sometimes read too hastily. So my takeaway is that one might perceive these mu'tabirun as eccentric, isolated mystics, detached from society's struggles. It's not fashionable to talk about them in a khutbah where you're supposed to say, let's all get out there on the street and do something, do something, do something. These authors retreated to the mountains or the back skirts of Seville with a legacy that would only become the critique would be that their legacy would become vaguely important decades later. Their work would have no bearing or influence on the lives and tribulations of the common believers. And I think this is a dismissive view. And I think it's a superficial reading of what our scripture and our faith calls us, is trying to bring our attention to at this time. And so what may come off as detached from real world concerns and turning inward while ignoring the suffering of communities, this very idea stems largely from colonial, early Arab nationalist, Salafist, reformist portrayals of the Sufi tradition. It's a very historically contingent idea, by the way, that very critique. It's a sort of early 20th century dodge by certain political actors in various parts of the Islamic world. It's a politically charged narratives, and it overlooks the profound cultural, socio-political, religious, artistic, and intellectual impact that these Mu'tabirun had on their communities, both in the short term and in the long term. When Ibn Barajan, the so-called detached, eccentric Sufi, was arrested by the Murabitun, they were afraid of him as a political threat because of how many people were drawn to him. And when he was brought to Marrakesh, the Emir refused to have him. He died shortly after his arrival in ambiguous circumstances in his 80s. The Emir of the Almoravids in Marrakesh refused to have a funeral prayed over him, and the whole city came out to in a show of defiance to honor this great Mu'tabir, this great scholars. And so to dismiss them is sort of to disregard the reverence that they commanded, the sacrifices they made, the significant socio-political roles that they fulfilled in the long term. And I think because they weren't frazzled, they weren't swayed, they weren't compromised or seduced by the sort of the anxiety climate of the day, their service to their community and just their repose of soul was itself a quiet but very powerful and important form of resistance and a wellspring of communal support. And so they saw themselves as part of a continuum, a longer term project, recognizing that long-lasting change doesn't happen in a year or even a decade. And so taking the famous Quranic edict to heart, they began by changing themselves in order to change the world, and they found the strength to plant seeds that they knew they would not live to witness its fruits, but that would live on after them. So that's my, I think, attempt at thinking with Ibn Barajan about how to cultivate spiritual resilience and about the importance of, yes, maybe you should withdraw from the political sphere once in a while and get off this, go on a media fast once in a while and engage in some contemplative exercises and renew your bonds with the tradition and with the academic pursuits that you're engaged in. They're not meaningless. They're just operating at a different level. You may not be, you may not, this book that I spent a lot of energy trying to write as faithfully as I can to Ibn Barajan. It'll outlive me, and it may impact hearts later on, but somebody has to also be part of that long-term conversation. And so it's not to dismiss anybody's role in the community, but it is to acknowledge the importance of i'tibar, of contemplation, and of setting time aside to really cultivate spiritual resilience. Because if that's gone, I don't want to be part of a nominally Muslim institution or community that's not stopping to pray and contemplate and read, and it's not pursuing a life of piety and doesn't have an ambitious pursuit of ethical life and so on. Any community would do it. Once we lose that, that aspect, that iman, that spark. It's, I mean, خلاص, we're done. Why would I just, for its own sake, protect a community that's not even rooted in its tradition? It has to begin with the roots. Yeah. So, anyway, tripped over my tongue a few times there, but I tried to think with you about my my thoughts on spiritual resilience, and maybe we can open the floor to some conversations. Or perhaps suggestions and like shared, because that's all I have to say. Like, this is where we now all talk together. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum. You mentioned the coherence of the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
Imam Ghazali, they recently published a translation of a book by the same title. Was there any connection between Imam Ghazali's work and Barazan's work?
Beautiful question. I actually do have something to say about that. So Ghazali is a contemporary of Ibn Barajan, and Ibn Barajan was hailed as the Ghazali of al-Andalus in his lifetime, meaning that the Andalusian, the community southern and Morocco, looked to him as their Ghazali. He wasn't influenced by him. His educational formation was not did not feature Ghazali on in his curriculum and the books that he read. But that title itself, the Ghazali of al-Andalus, became, I think, a profound gesture to the fact that we too in the Maghrib have our scholars who defend the tenets of the religion and who embody our religious ideals just the way the East, the Mashriq, does. But for Quranic coherence itself, they were probably having similar thoughts at the same time. I can almost guarantee that Ibn Barajan did not read Ghazali's book on probably Jawahir al-Quran or some text. I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
Right.
Pearls of the Quran.
It was just a trend.
Oh, all right. I'm not aware of it, but he only read Ghazali at the end of his life when the Al-Muravid authorities were threatened by Ghazali and decided to burn his books in the mosque of Cordoba, and that's when he heard. That's probably when he was called the Ghazali of al-Andalus. But another good sort of indication that it was probably not the best time to engage the political sphere if you're someone like Ibn Barajan. But somebody has to be around that mirror and to issue some fatwas and so on. Yeah. I just see the two as complementary. Tim.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum
Thank you so
salam.
much. This was great. My mind is kind of turning on this idea, this kind of internalization of activism. And I'm wondering if you think that this had anything to do with I'm thinking of Imam Ghazali's use of the term fiqh al-qalb, right? The idea that fiqh now becomes an inner, like an interior science, and also Ibn Baquda with his Fara'id al-Qulub, similar, using the Jewish author using legal language to talk about the inner work. And I'm wondering if the interiorization of fiqh is, you think, part of this kind of resilience, this insistence that inner work is activism, and it is as worthy of I guess the
Right.
what had become a legal term, fiqh, right?
Yeah.
That it's almost like a restorative move where they kind of take fiqh out of a completely exoteric space and repatriate it in the inner world.
Beautiful, yeah. I mean, I think that term, fiqh al-qulub, or the jurisprudence of the heart, or the inner work, it's hard. It's very that term itself carries this connotation that this is heavy lifting, it's hard work. It's as hard as working in the outer world, and I think that the attitude, for someone like Ibn Barajan was that, it was a question of, choosing the right time to engage, broadly speaking, in history, in the arc of time, but also in terms of one's own inner development and ability to then engage the political sphere, because it's advanced Tawheed, basically. Medina it comes after Mecca for good reason. You first cultivate presence with your Lord in solitude, and that is hard work. Once you've stabilized, then you can move that out into the external world without it necessarily affecting you, but you affecting it, so that you're part of the world and you're not, you're somewhat insulated internally from the ups and downs and the vicissitudes of history. Hence the tendency for activists to burn out, and for there to be a lot of internal splits and disappointments and so on. I think it's the lesson from Ibn Barajan would be that it's because it's too hard. Like it's Tawheed al-Farq. It's what the Sufis call this. Proclaiming God in the external realm is harder than doing so in Tawheed al-Jama' in solitude. So you first master La ilaha illallah and then Muhammad Rasulullah. Like you begin with Makkah, then Medina or Jama', and then Farq. And so the indiscriminate sort of like call to go out there and do something, I think is misguided to a certain extent. Of course, we have to stand in protest and in solidarity with the Ghazans, and of course we have to donate to the Sudanese and stand with whoever needs our help and with the oppressed. But once it starts consuming and really eroding our ability to manage, and anyway, I'm just meandering here, but I'll stop there. Maybe you had a follow-up on that?
No. I'm just thinking about the emergence of those of this language at a time. Clearly, Imam Ghazali had his own kind of traumatic experience with the political situation of his time. I don't know very much about the life of Ibn Battuta, but the Jewish mystic. But I'm just wondering if they were that language, the kind of the hammering out of that kind of language was a response to a clear choice to go inward when the world around them seemed to be in a state of collapse. And
Well, the language in Ibn Barajan is quite distinct from that of Ghazali. He doesn't use terms like ilm al-akhirah, or the science of the hereafter, or ulama'u dunya, these like critiques of the scholars, worldly scholars, or the term you used was fiqh al-qulub. Fiqh al-qalb. That vocabulary actually wasn't his. He's coming out of this local Andalusian tradition that's engaged with a different set of texts. The Rasail of Ikhwan Safa being one of them, the Brethren of Purity, basically compilations of reflections on the Quran by people who are deeply engaged in Greek philosophical texts, and so he finds them to be useful resources to think about, above and below, like the big picture. He's talking about the cycles of divine decree, dawa'ir taqdir, and it's very Quranic too. If you think about it, it's inna fi khalqis samawati wal ard, like in the creation of the heavens and then the earth. Like you first contemplate the heavens and the big picture and the rise and fall of civilizations and the rise and demise of a dynasty or of a human state, and this and that. Keep the large picture in mind. Inna fi khalqis samawat, and then al-ard, the narrow. So they really took that to heart, that teaching. Whereas when we try to just go all out with sort of just activism, it's like inna fi khalqil ard, like we lose the samawat part and we just enter the ard, and the ard is really a very constricting place. It's dayq, it's taqyid, it's samawat, it's si'a, it's wusa, it's all embracing. And the Quran Allah Ta'ala always reminds us of the big picture and then the small one, and that's how they were able to cultivate their strength, you know. I thought about that when this summer I went to Greece. I was looking at the rise and fall of civilizations, and it was in the middle of, you know, I was like, this drone, that drone. I mean, it was such a horror show for so many weeks, and the monotonous sort of khutbahs I was hearing in Morocco, and irrelevant to the context. And then I go to Greece, and there's like all these civilizations kind of came and went, and the Minoans, and this and that, and thousands, big spans. Subhanallah, dawa'ir al-taqdir, you know, the cycles of divine decree. Ibn Barajan was thinking about that big picture in the context of, and I found it liberating. I found it to be really liberating to put things in perspective, and then to be able to plant a seed with some intention and some resilience. Be like, oh, Bismillah, this little page of this manuscript may not solve the world's problems, but I can plant it and find some meaningful, maybe a little meaningful change one day. Wallahu alam. Astaghfirullah. Yes.
Thank you for introducing me to Ibn Marajan, and I will certainly try to find out more about him. I think it was an interesting period of history that you described, and there are certain parallels, but it's not identical. And similarly with the issue with Medina and Mecca, the Muslims were at the verge of extinction, all through till the victories, almost till Mecca, victory of Mecca. So it's a different time, and we have different tools. And yes, there will be people who will run away, and there will be people who will burn out. But ask the victims, and ask those who stand by them, that how many will be left standing. And that's the real issue, that in this world is created so we may win the next one. There is no place of shelter in this world now, because they can look into your hearts. And so we have to say what we have to say. If we don't say it, it will still be found out. So you can't go to the mountain. Iqbal famously in his opening lecture on Reconstruction says that that's the difference between the mystic and the prophet. What the prophet had achieved in Hira, all mystics wish for, but he returned to the dirty streets of Mecca and to the pagans and to the all difficult people and cruel people to give his message. That is the command of God. And so how do we muster it in this difficult situation that we think is difficult? But obviously people who have gone before us, like in the times of the Mongols and the Crusades, and as you described, the destruction of Andalusia, their difficulties were far greater. We have now something to tell the world that they have a book, and that is the book of human rights and international law, which was not there before. And so how do we use that? No, I don't mean use that in a derogatory sense, but I mean, how do we align with it to hold them to those standards? And I think that's the task, because the Quran says it is not that you don't have the book, but you don't judge by it. It's not saying that your book is wrong. It may be wrong, but you have a book, but you don't judge by it. And I think when 9/11 happened, that was the issue. There wasn't a U.S. Constitution, but you didn't want to judge by it. So it's not that we don't have a law. So how many people who are not Muslims or who are otherwise people of goodwill can we muster to bring together and say that this is what we have agreed upon? And hence we have agreed upon all people of goodwill should support it. And that's the technique. How are we going to do that? And how are we going to do it not only for ourselves but for other people? So I think that's the issue, instead of being depressed. And there are 2 billion Muslims in the world. We are very few here. So God takes use of people as he wills. Iqbal's famous couplet is about, I don't know if you know Urdu, but Paswa mil gaye Kaabe ko sanam khane se. The Mongols, in their hordes became Muslim. Chagtais and others, and the Golden Horde, and all the way up to Moscow. And so we don't know what is going to happen to the people of this country or of Europe or of Africa or other places, once we stand with our message, and I mean by message of justice and message of truthfulness, and to stand by our convictions. There were difficulties, they say that the prophets were cut apart into two, that's the Jewish tradition. We should look at the Jewish tradition and how they made mistakes or misinterpreted the data, and how they reneged on their promises, and how they tried to think about their time as God's time. I think we don't want to make that mistake. And as you were saying, I think very rightly so, that we can only think about human time. We can't think really of God's time, but what He wants to do in what time. So, and that, I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a geneticist. I understand the issue in terms of when people talk about, for example, the biggest challenges to the modern mind, modern Muslim mind. One of them is the issue of biological evolution, how that works in God's time. So I think, as you were saying, enlarge our and teach the youth, because there is this huge materialist, ocean that's roaring at us,
Right.
and we don't have good answers.
Thank you, sorry, I don't want to, sorry. What
Okay,
question?
thank you for cutting me off.
Yeah, no. Thank you for letting me know.
Are you going to respond? I don't want to, if you want to react to that, then
I mean, it was a rich reflection. There was a lot there. I mean, running away versus burning out. I mean, I'm trying to maybe avoid those binaries where you're either in the mountains or you're, feet on the street. You're either following the prophetic way or the mystical way, but rather thinking about I think we're both just agreeing on the same goals, but in different ways. So the question is, where does meaningful change lie, and when is it most appropriate to act at certain planes, and when it isn't? And certainly I think there's a place where we can come as a community where we don't think just dualistically like that. Whereas Islam says you should do the work out there, because Islam doesn't say just do the work out there. It also says do the work in here. And it's not only Sahaba on the battlefield; it's Sahaba in a suf. There's the people of the bench who are in retreat for months and months and months on end, and whose impact is undeniable, including people like Abu Huraira and so on. So people have impact on various levels, and I think there's just a space for civilization that can accommodate many different dispositions, and I appreciate the reflection. Mahan.
thank you. We need to get Dr. Tiku back for his own lecture, and we've been talking about it, and I think that would just be fantastic.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna see you there when he comes. So.
That's right.
I want to this binary that we've been going back at, this either or.
Yeah.
Either you're in the mountains, either you're in the big picture, or there's a tension here, or you're out on the street. And there's something, you try to reconcile that in the middle by sequencing it, if I heard you correctly. That you need to have a certain amount of spiritual resilience, so that when you're in the street, in the political arena, that you're able to withstand the trauma, the shocks, the challenges that throws at you. But then there's another thing that I heard, which was not sequenced, but that there are some people who are people of the mountain, who are people of big ideas, who are thinking of otherworldly things, and that's okay. And then there's some people who are people of politics, and perhaps they need, even people of politics need a certain amount of resilience in order to be able to do that well and to protect themselves. But nonetheless, there's a permanence, there's two different kinds of people. So I want you to tell us maybe a little bit more about this in light of today. And here's my specific question for that purpose.
Yeah.
Today, you start with Gaza, and that's the basically backdrop of our conversation on crisis. We have some people who say, if you didn't speak up this past year, like you said, I had a hard time speaking, then you're complicit. You're complicit. You have to speak up because you have power, you have position, you have a microphone, you have to speak up. So they almost condemn people of activism, shun or condemn or at least disparage those who are kind of thinking more inwardly. And there are great scholars who are thinking inwardly, who are saying now is not the time. Like this kind of activism is going to lead to no good, only more harm. So how do you respond to that, our present moment, and this kind of bifurcation that we've seen emerge in our discourse?
Well, I mean, I don't have a fully matured theory of spiritual resilience. So I really appreciate how you pointed out these two, sort of there's the sequencing, you first work within and then you go out. And I see that in the Sirah. The Prophet ﷺ practiced the i'tikaf throughout the month of Ramadan every year throughout his life, and made it up when he didn't, when he wasn't able to do i'tikaf. That's what I studied when I studied in the Sirah, that he withdrew a month out of the year, every year for throughout his prophetic career. That's a long time to step away from things, unless of course there's a real sort of urgent pressing affair, and then he'd make the days up. I found that to be a fascinating gem there, because it means that it's not just a question of making sure you're doing the inner push-ups before you go out, into the world, but it's also throughout your life tending to that aspect of your life as you age and as you go through different phases. You keep going back to that place, to that space of quiet and contemplation and learning and so on. So it's sequencing inner than outer, but also returning to it, always sort of almost like a back and forth between the inner and the outer, until ideally there isn't a difference. In terms of in Ibn Barajan's time, and I'm sorry I'm all over the place here, but so there was a go out there and just do the work figure in Ibn Barajan's time. His name was Ibn Qasi, and he started his own state, and he was a revolutionary, and he died with his head attached to the end of a spear, and did not have a very glorious legacy, did not leave much of an impact, was considered completely sort of compromised. And he had like a quite an amazing flowery Arabic sort of literary style, and some Khal'u Na'layn, he has a book on discarding the two shoes, and he had these sort of spiritual teachings. But he wasn't regarded by later generations as being an exemplar of the tradition, precisely because his political project failed miserably, and it was badly timed. And he would have probably been more impactful and probably offered more to the community had he stayed in the mountains and nurtured his immediate, served the community around him directly. Wallahu a'lam. I mean, this question of speaking up or you're complicit, that's just, you're just not reading sort of the hawamim, like the not identifying that, well, there are allies in the community, maybe, I don't know who you have in mind exactly, but there is a place for those who have sympathies with our message or our cause or even our beliefs, or even hold them, and the Hawamim point out that we should identify those allies but not alienate them and say you're either with us or against us, or either speak out or you're out of the pale. But yeah, I'd much rather hear others reflect at this point. Really, yeah. Bismillah.
Bismillah, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
So I really wanted to say I appreciated this lecture a lot.
Thank
I feel like it's a really universal phenomenon globally now, because studies are showing that people are protesting and are more active than any other time in history. But the protests and the activism is less efficacious than any other time in history. And so like when we ask ourselves why with like social media and everything, are these like our big displays of activism less effective? And it really comes down to like not during the civil rights movement, like we think we joke a lot about that today. Like, could we do the Montgomery bus boycott and like carpool for 3 years and walk to work and school for 3 years? I mean, you know, who knows? Like in this day and age, and that kind of community building and that kind of neighborhood building, you have to know who these neighbors are and you have to look out for each other, etc. It's just not present as much today, and it's not heavily centered the way it was in a lot of previous, I guess, eras or eons in Islamic studies. And like even the Black Panthers, they wouldn't let people join the organization unless they read certain books. So like you have to read Mao's little red book and The Wretched of the Earth and some other really important texts in order to even join the organization, because they recognized that you really had to engage with the material and understand what was happening before really coming into the streets. And so I think what a lot of people do now is they see one like infographic on social media, and then you're out on the streets and like so many people are looking for community, but so many people are scared. And so I wonder like if we really got down to the roots, you know, we tried to get to know our neighbors with that. And I love Islam's emphasis on activism in different ways, like so the Jadia, for instance, like planting trees is a form of activism. You know, there's so many different ways to perform activism, even in Islam, that are beyond like just like what we see on social media, I guess.
The inner work as a form of activism.
Yes, yeah.
Because you know, the hadith that we select as a community, it's not throughout time that you heard on khutbahs, everybody's talking about if you want to change something in the world, you have to change yourself first. It's not throughout time that the hadith about Umar saying, oh no, the brother who works is better than the brother who's in retreat. There are other hadiths where you have, you know, there will be a time when it's better to herd sheep and to go out with a wooden sword. And like the whole spectrum is there within our tradition, and I think it's just a question of stepping back and finding a balance between the two sort of modes of activism, basically. Yeah, I see.
Yes, so several times, and thank you so much for that wonderful talk. But just now you used the term inner work. And I think, you know, we live in kind of a new agey time, right? So there's, I would guess that we probably don't have a common understanding of what inner work is. And even if we think of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in the cave of Hira doing inner work, or Ibn Arajan doing inner work, and how did they know what that inner work is? So, for example, in the later Sufi tradition, one has a Sufi guide and one has a certain training and a discipline. Or in most spiritual paths, let's get interreligious, you know, one learns to meditate, to focus. In other words, it's not like you just, if you went, perhaps you have, but if you've gone and sat in a cave or, you know, even done itikaf, right? It's like, well, do I recite this litany so many times? So really the whole inner work thing, okay? It's like inner work within a tradition, and also inner work as a kind of discipline. So some of it is actually, if I can hold forth, a kind of developing certain strategies, capacities, and then one may, there can be an ethical dimension of, you know, kind of working with one's inner, but let's say if it's taming the nafs, you know, taming the ego. Well, if you're sitting in a cave, I mean, you might remember but without that interaction with other people, that's going to catch your ego, you know, in the, you know, the whole inner work thing. Of course, there are various dimensions of inner work. It's not, everybody's inner work is not the same in every tradition. But I think one might be urged to be a little more, what would I say? It would be interesting to pursue what Ibn Barajan, you know, if he talked about what he understood inner work as being. But I think we also can reflect on that, because it sounds nice to go out and study and meditate, but without a kind of spiritual discipline, I might call it. That inner work might be vague, and it actually might be rather difficult to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was sort of assuming that we're on the same page in terms of devotional life, intensification of one's prayers, or reciting of the Quran, or contemplating the Quran, or studying Hadith, or engaging in other disciplines with a view to developing some kind of theological tradition or set of ideas that are faithful to the Islamic tradition and speak to the present. I mean, sort of bundling all that up in a few terms, but yeah.
If I can come back to you, so to me,
Yeah.
that sounds like a very intellectually, like there's different flavors and different capacities. So
Yeah.
if you're an intellectual, a pious intellectual, that might be your path in work.
Mhm.
But I would say that it seems to me that some of these sufis,
Yeah.
it's like the landscapes of the soul. So reading the Quran or doing extra devotion might take you into those landscapes. But some of their contribution was, in fact, they did that journey and they mapped the landscapes, for others so that they could follow upon that
Yeah.
path. So again, maybe I'm arguing a little bit, not in all cases, but in many cases, one might need a guide or
Sure, a mentor.
to those landscapes, because simply reciting or simply doing 100,000 la ilaha illallah, it might take you somewhere, but it might be good to already have some sense of that map. So there's an interaction between the experience and the concept of the experience.
Right.
And the beings, right? The connections with these sources of guidance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the point that I'm trying to convey is, having a way of life where our faith is grounded in our daily life, in our private religious lives, where we're able to punctuate our day with prayer. We can tend to or expose ourselves to, or keep curious about the intellectual life, the life of the mind, the various ways of engaging ourselves internally, while also doing what should be done in the present context, without just saying, if you're not out there on the street, if you're not speaking out right now, you've betrayed the tradition, or you've anyway. Be that.
This will be the last comment and question.
And I'll try not to digress here. So first of all, thank you for the great conversation. Every time listening to you or Professor Timothy or Professor Mahan, I almost feel like I also need a dictionary. You guys speak so eloquently, so it's beautiful to be in the audience.
Thank you.
In terms of just the personal development here, that how do we participate in this discourse, in this effort, in this struggle? That to me, it seems like what you're saying is that it's not necessarily a binary process or binary choice. It's a continuous process of evolution where we kind of, based on our own resource optimization, we figure out what's the best for me. Do I go out in the activism side, or do I sit here and say, hey, I need to develop internally so I can be a better activist on the street? I remember growing up, one of the stories that would be told to us again came with Prophet Muhammad's hijrah from Mecca to Medina. And we talked about Mecca period, but we talked about Medina period. But there was this episode where the Prophet and his companion were hiding in a cave, in between the two cities.
Right.
And there was an emphasis on just being quiet. So to the point of that there was I don't know how historically accurate is it that there was a spider built a web on the face of the cave. So so they can hide, or their location is not discovered. But there's that part of the prophet where he's hiding in a cave, quiet, and drop silence that nobody notices him. But then there's the same prophet who, 10 years later, walks into Mecca, conquers it without any bloodshed. So, and for me, the personal struggle comes is that when is the time to retreat? When is the time to know that, hey, I have sufficient enough reservoir built up to go out and be a better activist? You brought up a great example of this activist out of al-Andalus, who next thing he has his head on his spear. I guess the modern day example I can think of is Che Guevara confronting his shooter, shoot, coward, shoot. And he shoots him to death, and to what end? Now we have Che Guevara on t-shirts.
Right.
So, but like in terms of, but internalizing these examples, where do and how do we identify that? Enough of this intellectual conversation, enough of this turning these pages internally and prepare myself sufficiently that I can go and be a better advocate for myself and my community.
Yeah.
Where is that optimal point?
Well, you know it internally when you're so consumed by the outer, like the activism, that you're torn within. It's probably time to withdraw. Probably time to fast, probably time to get off the phone, probably time to just open the Quran and do your ibadah for a few weeks until you're back in tune. Or you get better at going back and forth between those worlds until one doesn't affect you, or because you said I need to, work internally so I can become a better activist. But there could be a point where your activism actually helps your inner life. It doesn't have to shake it up. And I'm just going to end with this story that captures what I'm trying to say. In the Nahj al-Balagha, it's a compilation of khutbahs ascribed to Ali ibn Abi Talib, one of the most profound sort of collections that unfortunately the Sunni community doesn't read much at all because of sensitivities, sectarian sensitivities. There's a khutbah there called the khutbah on Tawheed. And Imam Ali radiallahu anhu is alayhi salam, or karamallahu wajhah, is walking out with his armies, and somebody asked him about Tawheed en route to battle, and his followers are like, give me a break, this is not time for Tawheed, this is time for takfir, for go out there and do something. And he said, no, we're going out there because of Tawheed. And he stops and he gives the most profound khutbah of that collection, khutbah fi Tawheed. And then they pick up their battles and they keep going. There's your activist right there, doing both, affirming one, but there's a time for Tawheed that could, for contemplating divine oneness and the qualities of Allah Ta'ala, Sifat al-Ula, in the midst of the chaos. That's sort of your La Fata illa Ali, right? There's no chivalrous human being but Ali, kind of, quite an amazing example, I think, for the, there's spiritual resilience at play. You don't get to that point where you can speak of Tawheed clearly and articulately on way to battle without doing a lot of this sort of inner and outer work, or however we put it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
So wonderful.